Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club. Based on true events. The winter station. Even now, years later, I still can't look at weather radar without feeling a surge of panic, and I always keep at least 3 different light sources within arm's reach at all times. Some fears, once acquired, never truly leave us. My name is Dr. Eliza Chen. I'm a climate scientist specializing in Arctic meteorology. 3 years ago, I accepted what should have been a career-defining opportunity, a 6-month assignment at the Norvik Research Station, positioned at 82 degrees north latitude in the Norwegian Arctic. The position was prestigious, but demanding. I would be the sole winter occupant, responsible for maintaining equipment and collecting crucial climate data during the polar winter. The isolation wasn't a deterrent for me. I'd done remote fieldwork before, and I've always been comfortable with solitude. In fact, I welcomed the chance to focus entirely on my research without distraction. The station was cutting edge, well equipped, and the data I'd be collecting would contribute to critical climate change models. 6 months seemed like a reasonable sacrifice for such an important contribution to science. I arrived at Norvik during the last week of possible air travel, before the polar winter would make flights impossible until spring. It was late September, and already the sun barely peaked above the horizon for a few hours each day. The light was perpetually in that golden hour state, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. The station itself was more extensive than I'd expected. A central research building flanked by separate living quarters, storage facilities, and an observatory positioned on a slight rise about 50 meters from the main complex. My orientation was rushed. Dr. Pedersen, the station chief, seemed anxious to get the supply plane loaded and airborne before an approaching weather system moved in. He hurried me through the basics: communication systems, emergency protocols, equipment maintenance schedules. When I asked about the previous meteorologist, Dr. Pedersen's expression tightened momentarily. Markus Kovalev left mid-assignment for personal reasons, he said, not meeting my eyes. His departure was unexpected. But these things happen in extreme environments. Not everyone is suited to the isolation. I wanted to ask more, but there wasn't time. Within hours, Dr. Pedersen and the support staff were boarding the plane, leaving me with stacks of manuals, access codes, and a hastily scribbled personal satellite phone number for genuine emergencies only. The next scheduled contact will be Monday at 0900 hours. Weekly video calls with headquarters are mandatory for psychological monitoring, were his parting words. Remember, the darkness affects everyone differently. If you start to feel unstable, there's no shame in saying so. I stood outside watching until the plane was a tiny speck against the vast Arctic sky. When the sound of the engines faded completely, I was struck by the absolute silence. No birds, no insects, no distant traffic. Just the occasional creak of the station adjusting to temperature changes and the whisper of wind across snow. That first night, I felt a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. I explored the station methodically, familiarizing myself with the layout. The main research building contained the meteorological lab, a small medical facility, and communications center. The living quarters were surprisingly comfortable: private bedroom, bathroom, a well-stocked kitchen, and a cozy common area with books and entertainment systems. I was checking the backup generators when the power briefly flickered. Just for a second, barely enough to notice, but when the light stabilized, I caught movement in my peripheral vision through the window. I turned quickly, heart suddenly racing, but saw nothing except the endless white landscape bathed in the security lights. Just snow and darkness beyond. I told myself it was probably just a fox or Arctic hare, though I couldn't help noticing there were no tracks in the fresh snow. That night, I dreamed of something moving beneath the ice, watching me through frozen layers, patient, ancient, waiting. The first week passed smoothly as I established my routine. Each morning, I'd check the meteorological instruments, log the previous night's data, and perform any necessary maintenance. The afternoons were dedicated to analysing patterns and preparing reports, while evenings were my time for reading, watching movies, or writing in my journal. The work was engaging enough to keep my mind occupied, and I was careful to maintain a healthy sleep schedule despite the rapidly diminishing daylight. By the end of that first week, the sun no longer rose above the horizon at all. We had entered the polar night, 4 months of darkness relieved only by moonlight, auroras, and the station's artificial illumination. There were small anomalies that week, things not where I'd left them. Occasional sounds from unused sections of the station that I attributed to the building settling in the cold. Once, I was certain I'd left a mug of tea on my desk, only to find it in the sink when I returned. Simple lapses in memory, I told myself. Nothing unusual about that in a new environment. The weekly video call with research headquarters in Tromsø became an important ritual, a connection to the outside world that helped maintain my sense of normalcy. Dr. Madsen, the project coordinator, would review my data findings, address any concerns, and make sure to include some casual conversation to assess my psychological state. I appreciated the thoroughness, even if it sometimes felt patronizing. During my second week, while looking for additional sensor equipment, I discovered a box of personal items that must have belonged to Markus Kovalev, the previous meteorologist. Nothing valuable, just books, a few photographs and notebooks filled with observations. What caught my attention was how his handwriting changed over time, starting as neat and methodical, but growing increasingly erratic in the later entries. The final pages contained strange diagrams and calculations that didn't appear related to standard meteorological measurements. I should have reported finding these immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. I began reading through his notes each evening after completing my own work. Most entries were ordinary: data collection, equipment maintenance, personal reflections on the isolation. But around the 3-month mark, there was a shift. Markus began documenting anomalies in the weather patterns, electromagnetic fluctuations that didn't match historical models, temperature inversions that defied explanation, and unusual aurora activity directly above the station. The last page of his logbook contained a single sentence that made my skin crawl. "It knows when you're watching. Don't trust the readings." That night, the first major storm hit. I'd been tracking its approach for days, but its intensity exceeded all predictions. Winds howled around the station at over 100 meharim, rattling the reinforced windows and driving snow into impenetrable white walls outside every window. Around midnight, the communications antenna was damaged, severing my high bandwidth connection to headquarters. The next morning, I ventured out in the protective gear to assess and repair the damage. The temperature was 40 degrees 6 with wind chill, making it feel even colder. Every exposed centimeter of skin felt like it was being stabbed with tiny needles. I managed to reposition the antenna, restoring basic communications capability, though the connection was notably weaker. While testing the signal strength on different frequencies, I picked up something unexpected: fragments of what sounded like human speech interspersed with static. This was impossible. There were no other research stations or settlements within hundreds of miles, no flights overhead, no one else but me. Yet there it was again, words too indistinct to understand, but unmistakably human in cadence and tone. And beneath the words, something else. A low, pulsing rhythm that didn't sound like any radio interference I'd ever encountered. I shut down the communication system and restarted it. The strange transmission was gone, replaced by the ordinary background static of Arctic radio silence. I convinced myself it had been some unusual atmospheric bouncing of distant signals, uncommon but not impossible in polar conditions with certain ionospheric activity. That night, I dreamed of voices calling from beneath the ice, speaking words in a language I almost understood. I woke up shivering despite the efficient heating system, with a distinct feeling that something in the station had changed while I slept. By the third week, the 24-hour darkness had become my new normal. I measured time by the clock alone, my circadian rhythm adjusting to a world without dawn or dusk. The weekly call with headquarters was now audio only due to bandwidth limitations following the antenna damage. Dr. Madsen assured me they were still receiving my data transmissions successfully, though there seemed to be a strange delay in our conversations, as if he was carefully considering each response. It was around this time I began hearing footsteps in empty corridors. The first time, I was certain someone else must have arrived at the station somehow. I called out, searched every room, checked the logs for any incoming communications I might have missed. Nothing. I was still alone, officially, at least. The temperature sensors in the unused eastern wing started showing anomalies, brief spikes registering human-level heat signatures in rooms I never entered. The power consumption graphs showed usage fluctuations I couldn't account for. Small things began to disappear. A favorite pen, a notebook, a chocolate bar I'd been saving. Sleep became increasingly difficult. I would jolt awake at odd hours, certain I'd heard doors opening or closing, equipment being moved. During one particularly restless night, I got up to make tea and glimpsed a figure in full Arctic gear standing motionless in the darkness beyond the window. When I rushed outside with a flashlight, there were no footprints in the fresh snow, no indication anyone had been there at all. I began documenting everything meticulously: temperature readings, equipment status, my own psychological observations. The journal became my anchor to rationality. If I could quantify and record the anomalies, surely there would be a scientific explanation for all of it. But science offered little comfort when I discovered log entries in the station's computer system that I had no memory of making. Detailed observations, equipment adjustments, even personal notes, all written in my ID during hours my journal indicated I had been asleep. During my next call with headquarters, I carefully mentioned some of the strange occurrences, framing them as curiosities rather than concerns. Dr. Madsen's response was oddly dismissive. Sensory experiences in extended isolation are common, Dr. Chen. The human mind seeks patterns and stimulation when deprived of normal input. I'm sending you some additional psychological exercises that should help. I wanted to believe him, to accept the rational explanation that I was simply experiencing the well-documented effects of prolonged isolation and darkness. But that explanation didn't account for the physical evidence, the moved objects, the unexplained temperature readings, the log entries I hadn't made. A week later, a massive storm system settled over the station. The meteorological readings were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Barometric pressure dropping to levels that should have been impossible at our latitude. Wind patterns that seemed to circulate specifically around the station, rather than following the prevailing Arctic currents. The storm brought near total darkness as the security lights struggled against the swirling snow and howling wind. During the worst of it, the main power failed completely. In the 45 seconds before the emergency systems activated, I experienced darkness so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against my skin. When the backup lights finally flickered on, casting everything in a dim red glow, I made a terrifying discovery. All the sealed doors to the unused eastern wing were standing open. I knew I had checked them that morning. I knew they had been securely locked. Yet now they gaped open like hungry mouths, revealing corridors that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of the emergency lighting. As I stood frozen in the hallway, trying to process what I was seeing, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, through the windows, in the brief illumination of an aurora through breaking clouds, a shape moving between buildings. Something in a parka, hunched against the storm, but moving with a strange, fluid gait that seemed unaffected by the hurricane-force winds. It was looking at the station, looking at me. That's when the communication system crackled to life with an incoming transmission from headquarters. It was Dr. Madsen, but his voice sounded strained, artificial. "Dr. Chen, we've been reviewing your data transmissions and have some concerns about the patterns you're reporting. We need you to disregard any anomalous readings and focus only on standard protocols until relief personnel can reach you." "When will that be?" I asked, desperate for human contact, for rescue. There was a long pause before he answered. "We're monitoring the weather systems. Current conditions make deployment impossible. Continue with standard observations and maintain mental health protocols." I was about to tell him about the open doors, about the figure I'd seen outside, when he said something that turned my blood to ice. "By the way, you mentioned finding materials from the previous meteorologist. There must be some mistake. There was no meteorologist named Marcus Kovalev stationed at Norvik. The last winter observer was Dr. Harlow 2 years ago." The transmission ended before I could respond, leaving me with nothing but static and the howling of the wind outside. The next morning, the storm had subsided, but the communication system was completely dead. No static, no signal, nothing. I tried every backup system, every emergency frequency. Silence. I was entirely cut off from the outside world. I barricaded myself in the main research building, securing the doors to the eastern wing with equipment racks and extra furniture. I needed time to think, to process what was happening. If there had never been a Marcus Kovalev at Norvik Station, whose notebooks had I found? Whose logs had I been reading? Whose warning was I ignoring? With the main communications array non-functional, I began searching the station for alternative equipment. In a storage locker near the backup generators, I discovered an old digital recorder, the kind used for dictation or field notes. It still had battery life and contained dozens of audio files dated from the previous winter season. The first recordings were mundane: equipment checks, weather observations, personal reminders. The voice was male, with a slight Russian accent. Marcus Kovalev, presumably, the man who, according to headquarters, had never existed. As I listened through the files chronologically, I heard the same progression I'd noted in his written logs: the gradual shift from standard observations to documentation of anomalies, the growing tension in his voice, the increasing frequency of unexplained phenomena. In one recording dated about 4 months into his assignment, Marcus described how he'd begun investigating the history of Norvik Station after experiencing events similar to what I was now going through. The original site survey for Norvik was conducted in 1922, but the current station wasn't built until 1998. His voice explained, tight with contained excitement or fear. What they don't mention in the official documentation is that the 1922 expedition never returned. All 8 members disappeared without explanation. Search parties found their camp intact, food still on plates, equipment in perfect condition, no signs of violence or evacuation. They had simply vanished. His voice dropped lower. I've been getting strange readings from the ice beneath the station. Temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies centered specifically under the observatory. I think whatever happened to that expedition might be related to what's happening now. Something about this specific location affects the instruments, and possibly human perception as well. The final recording was dated just 3 days before my arrival at the station. Marcus sounded exhausted, his words slurring slightly as if he hadn't slept in days. "They're getting bolder," he whispered. "I see them more clearly now. They move through the walls like they're not solid. They watch me while I work. They're fascinated by the measurements, by our instruments. They've been here all along, living in the spaces between what we can perceive, the electromagnetic field fluctuations, the temperature inversions. Those are side effects of their movement between states of being, I guess you could say. They're studying us as much as we're studying the climate. And I think they're learning to cross over more completely." The recording ended with a sound I couldn't identify, something between static and a low, rhythmic humming that made my teeth ache when I heard it. That night, I noticed food supplies diminishing faster than my consumption could explain. Equipment would be moved or reconfigured when I wasn't looking. And twice, I woke from fitful sleep to find my bedroom door standing open, though I distinctly remembered closing and locking it before lying down. I set up my laptop camera to record the main lab overnight while I slept. The footage I reviewed the next morning showed nothing unusual for the first few hours. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the screen flickered, and when the image stabilized, there were shapes moving through the room, distorted, elongated figures that seemed to bend in impossible ways. They moved around the meteorological equipment, leaning close as if examining the readings. One approached the camera directly, its features blurred and shifting, before the video abruptly ended. I was no longer documenting the phenomena just for scientific record keeping. I was gathering evidence to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. As the weeks wore on, my grip on reality began to slip. Sleep deprivation and constant vigilance took their toll. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. I heard voices in the static of dead communication channels, whispering words just beyond comprehension. I found journal entries written in my own handwriting that I had no memory of writing. These entries described conversations with the others and detailed observations about the spaces between measurements where they exist. One particularly disturbing passage read, "They're curious about our world. They've always been here, watching us try to quantify and measure their realm with our crude instruments. The readings aren't errors, they're side effects of their presence." The station's heating system began to fail section by section, forcing me to navigate parts of the complex I'd been avoiding. The temperature dropped dangerously in the outer buildings, pipes freezing and cracking, equipment failing. I had to enter the eastern wing to access the maintenance systems. The unused sections of the station had changed. Equipment had been rearranged in configurations that made no functional sense. Walls were covered with the same strange symbols I'd seen in Marcus's later notebooks. In what had once been a storage room, I found a collection of station equipment, thermometers, barometers, anemometers, arranged in a precise circle around a chair, as if for an audience. In the observatory, I discovered the extent of Marcus's secret work. Hidden behind standard equipment was a makeshift laboratory where he had conducted experiments well beyond meteorological research. A concealed hard drive contained hundreds of files, research papers on electromagnetic anomalies, quantum physics theories about parallel dimensions, and studies of historical disappearances in the Arctic region. His notes outlined a hypothesis that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying: that the extreme magnetic anomalies at our location, combined with unique atmospheric conditions during the polar winter, created what he called a thin spot between dimensions. His calculations suggested these conditions were cyclical, reaching peak intensity every 101 years, which aligned precisely with the disappearance of the 1922 expedition. Most disturbing were the photos, hundreds of them, taken with specialized equipment Marcus had modified. They showed what appeared to be translucent, elongated humanoid figures gathered around the station's instruments, their forms distorted as if viewed through rippling water. In some images, they seemed to be reaching toward the cameras themselves. The final video file was dated the day before my arrival. Marcus looked directly into the camera, his eyes bloodshot, face gaunt from lack of sleep. "If you're watching this, you've either found what I've found, or they've led you to it," he said. "They were here before us. They've always been here. They exist in a state parallel to our reality, perceivable only under specific conditions that happen to align with extreme polar electromagnetic activity. They're curious about our measurements, our attempts to quantify their world." He leaned closer to the camera, lowering his voice. "I've been teaching them about ours. They're quick learners, and they want to visit." The video ended with Marcus turning to address something off-camera, his expression a mixture of fear and reverence. That night, as I huddled in the increasingly cold main building, I reviewed the weather data I had been collecting since my arrival. The patterns of anomalies matched exactly what Marcus had highlighted in his research, but they were intensifying, building towards some kind of peak. It wasn't random. It wasn't instrument error. Something was deliberately creating these conditions. As if responding to my realization, the station systems began failing systematically. First the backup generators, then the emergency heating. The temperature inside dropped rapidly, forcing me to move from room to room, sealing off sections to conserve what little warmth remained. The motion sensors I'd placed throughout the station activated continuously, despite my remaining stationary. On the security camera feeds, I caught partial images of those same distorted, elongated figures moving through walls and solid objects as if they weren't there. With the temperature approaching dangerous levels, I was forced to retreat to the emergency shelter, a reinforced room designed to keep a single person alive in extreme conditions. As I gathered critical supplies, all the lights in the station suddenly extinguished, plunging me into absolute darkness. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw my breath crystallizing in the frigid air. I made it to the emergency shelter with minutes to spare before hypothermia would have set in. Inside, with the door sealed and emergency heater running, I found something that hadn't been there during my previous checks. A final logbook from Marcus, hidden beneath the survival gear. His last entry explained everything. He had found a way to invite them across by creating specific electromagnetic conditions using modified station equipment. He believed communication with these entities would revolutionize science, that they had knowledge that could transform our understanding of physics, climate, perhaps even consciousness itself. "They exist in the spaces between our measurements," he wrote. "When we try to quantify the world, we create rigid frameworks that sometimes capture glimpses of their reality. They've been watching us through our instruments, learning about us as we learn about the Arctic. And now, They want more direct contact. As I read these words, the most intense storm yet engulfed the station. The wind screamed around the shelter with impossible force, rattling the reinforced door. The emergency radio crackled with that same strange rhythm I'd heard before, not static, but something deliberate, patterned, almost like speech slowed down 1,000 times. My flashlight flickered, and in the momentary darkness, I felt something brush against my face, cold, but not like ice or metal. Cold, like the space between stars. When the light stabilized, I was no longer alone in the shelter. I couldn't see them clearly. They existed at the edge of perception, their forms seeming to bend around the limitations of human vision. But they were there, watching me with what felt like intense curiosity. In that moment, I understood what had happened to Marcus. He hadn't left the station at all. He had simply crossed over, joined them in whatever state of existence they inhabited. The storm outside reached a deafening crescendo, and I realized it wasn't a natural phenomenon at all. It was the manifestation of entities crossing between states of reality. The atmospheric disturbance created by the thinning of whatever separated their world from ours. In a moment of clarity, or perhaps madness, I grabbed the emergency beacon, a device designed to transmit a distress signal that could be detected thousands of miles away. My only chance for rescue was to activate it before the storm made detection impossible, or before I lost the ability to operate it. I had to reach the observatory, the highest point of the station, and the place where the signal would have the best chance of transmission. That meant crossing the station complex during the height of the storm, through areas now fully exposed to the killing cold of the Arctic winter. Bundling myself in every protective layer available, I forced the shelter door open against hurricane-force winds. The main buildings were barely visible through the swirling snow, the darkness so complete that my flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead. The journey across the station complex became a nightmarish obstacle course. Temperatures below 60 degrees burned my lungs with each breath. Ice had formed over every surface, transforming familiar pathways into treacherous alien landscapes. And all around me, moving through the storm as if unaffected by it, were the entities, more visible now than ever before, their elongated forms flickering in and out of perceptibility. I felt them watching, following, some even reaching toward me with appendages that seemed to both exist and not exist simultaneously. They didn't seem hostile, merely curious, scientists observing a specimen perhaps, but their very presence affected the physical world, creating impossible cold, electrical disturbances that made my flashlight strobe, and spatial anomalies that made distances seem to stretch and contract. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, I reached the observatory. Inside, everything had been transformed. The equipment had been rearranged into incomprehensible patterns, creating what looked like a complex three-dimensional model of something I couldn't begin to understand. In the center of it all, perfectly preserved by the extreme cold, was a body. Marcus Kovalev, positioned as if presenting the equipment to unseen observers. His face was frozen in an expression of awe or terror, perhaps both. Around him, the entities moved with increasing solidity, their forms becoming clearer as whatever barrier separated our realities continued to thin. With numbing fingers, I activated the emergency beacon, setting it to transmit the international distress signal continuously. As the first ping resonated through the observatory, the entities reacted, gathering closer, their movements becoming more agitated. Through the stacked equipment, through the storm-lashed windows, I could see more of them arriving, dozens, perhaps hundreds, converging on the station from the empty whiteness beyond. They moved with purpose now, and I realized with dawning horror that the beacon wasn't just signaling for human rescue. It was somehow calling to them, strengthening whatever connection Marcus had established. The observatory equipment began to activate on its own, screens flickering to life, sensors whirring, data flowing across displays in patterns that made no mathematical sense. The entities moved among it all, interacting with the technology in ways that defied physics. One approached me directly, its form now almost fully visible, a towering, attenuated figure with proportions that hurt to look at directly. Like an optical illusion given three-dimensional form, it reached toward me with what might have been a limb, and as it made contact, my mind exploded with information, images, sensations, concepts for which I had no reference point. I understood in that moment that they had been watching human attempts to measure and understand Arctic phenomena for decades, perhaps centuries. They existed in a state parallel to our reality, perceivable only under the specific conditions Marcus had identified and amplified. They'd been studying humans as we study weather, with detached scientific curiosity. And now, through Marcus's work and my unwitting continuation of it, they had found a way to cross over more completely. As consciousness faded, the last thing I saw was the entity leaning close, examining me with something that might have been compassion or might have been clinical interest, the way a researcher might regard a lab specimen that had outlived its usefulness. I woke in a hospital bed in Tromsø 3 days later. According to the medical staff, a rescue team had responded to the automated distress beacon and found the station in ruins. Structural collapse due to catastrophic storm damage was the official explanation. They discovered me in the observatory, suffering from extreme hypothermia and frostbite, but miraculously alive. There was no mention of Marcus Kovalev's body, no acknowledgement of the entities I had seen, no explanation for the bizarre reconfigurations of equipment. When I tried to explain what had happened, the doctors increased my sedation and added a psychological evaluation to my treatment plan. Over time, I learned to stop talking about what I had experienced. I accepted the narrative of equipment failure and storm damage. I nodded along as they explained that my hallucinations were the result of oxygen deprivation, isolation, and extreme cold. I took the prescribed medications and completed the mandatory therapy sessions. 6 months after my rescue, I was cleared to return to work. Not in field research, but at a university weather center where I could analyze data in the safety of civilization, surrounded by colleagues and normal human interaction. I let everyone believe I had recovered, that I had moved past the traumatic experience. But in private, I continued Marcus's research, using university equipment to track similar electromagnetic anomalies worldwide. I discovered dozens of locations with patterns matching what we had recorded at Norvik. Thin spots, where our reality brushed against theirs, where our careful measurements sometimes captured glimpses of something beyond our understanding. 3 weeks ago, I received an email from an untraceable source. The attachment contained images from the new research team at Norvik Station. Ordinary meteorological data at first glance, but hidden within the patterns were the same anomalies. The same signatures I had learned to recognize. They were back, or perhaps they had never left. The final image wasn't scientific data at all, but a security camera still from inside the rebuilt observatory. In it, a researcher stood with his back to the camera, facing a bank of meteorological instruments. Behind him, barely visible but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for, were elongated, translucent figures standing in a half circle, watching over his shoulder as he recorded measurements of their world. That night, as I sat staring at my computer screen, I noticed something in the reflection of my darkened office window. Not just my own tired face, but elongated shapes standing behind me, watching as I analyze the data with the same scientific curiosity I once believed was exclusively human. They had followed me home. Have you ever experienced that feeling of not being alone, even when you know you are? That sensation of being watched when no one else is present? What did you attribute it to? Perhaps it wasn't imagination. Perhaps in that moment, something was studying you through the spaces between what we can perceive, curious about the creature that tries so desperately to measure and understand a universe far stranger than we can comprehend. I still analyze weather patterns. I can't help myself. But now I know I'm not just observing atmospheric conditions. I'm catching glimpses of them moving through their world that intersects with ours. And sometimes, when I look at the patterns long enough, I swear they're looking back,